Hello and welcome to Datacolor's 2012 webinar series. I'm David Tobie, Global Product Technology Manager at Datacolor. Today's webinar will be on calibration for soft proofing. Our guest presenter for this series is David Saffir, a good friend of mine and a professional photographer, author, educator, etc. from Southern California, who's come here to the East Coast to work with us on this particular webinar. So we're grateful to have him here in person. And we'll get started in a moment, so stick around and hopefully you'll learn something about soft proofing, something about calibration, and something about photography. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. This is David Saffir. This Datacolor sponsored webinar is about color management and soft proofing using Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom 4. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering what the heck is soft proofing. And right out of the Adobe technical files, soft proofing is a color-accurate on-screen preview of the appearance of your image, modeling your selected output device. Now, typically that's a printer. And what does that mean? That means that you can set up your computer, your laptop, or your desktop to emulate the color, the hue, saturation, brightness, light, highlight and shadow detail, etc. of your output device, usually your printer, like I said before. Not only that, it gives you a huge advantage in editing in that once you turn it on, you can see cause and effect, the impact of changes that you make while you're editing. So if you make a change in luminance or lightness, you're going to see that change, and it's going to simulate what the printer is going to produce. Similarly, if you correct a color cast, you're going to see the impact of that, and it's going to be pretty darned accurate, provided, of course, that you've calibrated and profiled your monitor or display. Now, Adobe provides this tool in Photoshop and now in Lightroom 4. And that makes a huge difference for me as far as Lightroom is concerned. Lightroom always gave you what I called a static preview. It was always geared towards a particular color space, and you had to guess what it was going to look like until you made a print, unlike in Photoshop. Now that soft proofing has been added to Lightroom 4, I'm thrilled. I think that's a great addition. It makes the Lightroom 4 workflow work much better. It gives you much more confidence in what your end result is going to be, and it's accurate and it's easy to use. It's just brilliant. Now, one of the other things that you should know, and I said this before and it's worth repeating, it's required that you do display calibration and profiling for accurate soft proofing. The computer has to have those corrections in place before you start with soft proofing. Otherwise, you don't really know what you're going to get. So it's part of a chain. It's calibrate and profile your display, do your image editing on screen with accurate soft proofing, and then produce a print that has a pretty decent match to what you've seen on your screen. So let's talk about the first step in color management as far as this webinar is concerned, and that's calibrating and profiling your display. The Spyder 4 is the newest tool from Datacolor. It's intended to help you tune your display for accuracy and consistency across the board. So that includes a single display, multiple displays, projectors, desktop or laptop, and believe it or not, iPad and iPhone does a great job in that department. And some people might think, well, this is just for color, but the fact is that calibration and profiling also helps you control highlight and shadow detail and luminance of the screen. And the fact is that most displays, if not all, come out of the box. They're much too saturated and contrasty and much too bright. And what you're doing is you're taming that beast. You're bringing it back into a space that is usable for you as a photographer. It gives you accurate color on screen. It allows you to proceed to enabling soft proofing, and it gives you the ability to get a good screen to print match, whether you're in a closed system working on your own desktop with your own printer or in a work group. And in particular, recently developed wide gamut displays, when I say recently, the last few years, They've become more affordable lately. Wide gamut displays may in particular be too saturated and high contrast out of the box. They're really high-powered devices. They kind of need a leash to really be usable, and the Spyder 4 is just a ticket for that. So color calibration is the key to success in soft proofing. It's the first essential step in taming that screen and getting it into shape for your particular use as a photographer. It lets you use on-screen soft proofing while you're editing so you can see what you're doing and see cause and effect. And at the end of the day, you're going to have a much better screen to print match than you would without it. Let's talk for a few minutes about the Spyder 4 display calibration device, which automates and simplifies your display calibration. It's pretty simple. You install the software, connect the Spyder 4 device via the USB port, and place the device on your screen or your iPhone or your iPad. And you move forward. You have some questions that you have to answer in the software screens. It can be as simple or as customized as you like. Now this next screen is part of the wizard-based interface, and when I say wizard, really what that means is that you're going to click on the next button and the software will walk you through the process step by step. Now also take note, see the cursor on the screen. You have the option of recalibrating your display. You can check the calibration, which is quite a bit faster, or you can do a full calibration of your display. Some of the other options that are on here are gamma, white point, and brightness, and I do get a lot of questions about these. Gamma, typically the 2.2 setting is the one that you want to be using for photography. The white point of 6500 is recommended. And then there's screen brightness, and here I'm showing a screen brightness of 120. Now that's in a room that's pretty dim. It's not completely dark. It might be a room that's got shuttered windows and a small lamp in the corner somewhere. That 120 would be about the right level for that. The first time that you go to that brightness level, if you've been used to a brighter screen, it's going to look a little bit strange, and it's going to take you a few days to get used to it. However, it's worth the effort because that lower brightness level protects your perception, particularly in shadows and highlights, of what detail is present in the image. So I suggest that you start with these settings, 2.2, 6500, or 120. Or as an alternate, you can use the expert settings, which I'll show you in just a moment. Now, if you choose to use the expert console rather than the wizard-based interface, you're going to find that there's quite a few options available to you, and you can combine them in a number of ways. I'm just going to work top to bottom here. I'm not going to get into excruciating detail. We did go into quite a bit of that in an earlier webinar, which was recorded and is provided online. You can select which display you want to calibrate, and if you have more than one monitor connected to your computer, that's a very useful thing. Some of us have two up, and we'd like to have the color matching on them, so that's a good thing. There's a whole series of targets here. They're provided for a number of uses, whether it's photo or video editing. You have choices. This one is just like the one on the screen previously, 2.2, 6500, and 120. Pretty standard for photographers. You can set your white point to a different white point if you need to, independently of the other settings. Gamma. You can set black and white luminance. You can, of course, turn calibration certification on and off. You can use ambient light compensation. You can also set gray balance calibration, which is very useful as it, in my view, gives a smoother result, particularly if you're going to be working in black and white. You can measure ambient lighting, and it will give you a recommendation for screen brightness, which can be very useful. And of course, you can choose your next action, whether it's a full calibration, a recalibration, or a calibration check. I also want to talk about a couple of other software tools that are provided with the Spyder 4, SpyderProof and SpyderTune. SpyderProof is pretty straightforward. You can toggle your calibration on and off and see the impact on hue, saturation, brightness, etc. on your screen from the calibration cycle that you just completed. And it's particularly useful because it provides such a nice variety of images to preview. They're arranged in 4 groups of similar images. For example, lower left you have scenics, lower right you have black and white, upper right you have portraits. And if you double click on any of these groups, those 4 images will expand to fill this space right here. And again, if you click on an individual image, once that's been zoomed in, the individual image will zoom to fill the space. And you can toggle on and off to see the impact on, again, hue, saturation, and brightness. I'm particularly impressed by the impact on highlight and shadow detail, just as an example, in the black and whites. There's almost always a dramatic improvement that you can see there. And of course, in the scenics with highly saturated bright colors, you will definitely see a difference. And in the portraits, skin tones are always going to be more accurate, realistic, and believable. So you can see the benefit of your calibration immediately, and of course see if it worked properly. The other tool that's on here is called SpyderTune, and SpyderTune, as far as I know, is unique to Datacolor and its product offering. What it allows you to do, it gives you sliders that allow you to make what I call micro or small adjustments to help you match this display to another display, perhaps an older unit that is a little bit off even after calibration, or to a print provided it's being viewed under a proper light source. And so you have a number of controls here. The first 2 are pretty much oriented around blue, red, purple, green, sort of like a color wheel, and of course gamma and brightness. And any combination of these can be used to fine-tune the match between your display and another device or print. Both very, very useful tools and really make life easier for photographers like us. So now that we have a calibrated display, we're going to talk about soft proofing. And this is the core of this presentation, and it's a very, very important part of image editing. Not everybody is aware of what it is. I think it's partly because of the way it's named, and that soft proofing is a term that's a little bit archaic. It's a holdover from the days of 4-color press, etc., etc. And soft proofing is just a color accurate preview of what your output device is going to deliver. That can be a display, it can be a printing device, such as your inkjet printer, and it has some real power going for it. In a sense, it's one of the most powerful tools that's available in Photoshop or Lightroom. It puts you in the driver's seat. That bears repeating. It puts you in the driver's seat. It lets you see what's going to happen and the impact, the cause and effect, the relationship between cause and effect as you make edits to your image. So if you make a curves adjustment, you're going to see the impact on screen long before you have to think about making a print. And so soft proofing is enormously powerful and useful. It puts you in a position to know whether that adjustment or correction or other image edit that you made was the right one, that it's going to be helpful or not helpful to you, and it's going to let you move on very efficiently to a finished product that you're going to appreciate and that your customers are going to like. Now, one of the things that you should know about soft proofing is that it's not automatic. You have to turn it on. And in fact, if you close an image or you open a new image, you have to turn it on again. So it's only on if you've turned it on. So what I do is I make it a habit. As soon as I open an image, I go to the View menu to Proof Setup, another not so intuitive term, and I go to Custom, and that's going to open a dialog box. And that dialog box is going to give us access to all of the color profiles that are available on a particular computer, the one that you happen to be working on. Now, once that dialog box comes up, there's going to be a drop down right here, it says Device to Simulate, and if you click on it, you're going to see a list, and on my computer there's a lot of profiles. You're going to see a list of all of the ICC profiles that are installed on your machine. Now, for example, when you install a printer, it's going to copy paper profiles for all the papers that manufacturer makes. Those paper profiles are going to be installed and be available to Photoshop. So you can pick any paper profile to preview. And so I'm going to show you this in a second. In the next example, you're going to see why I chose plain paper. It gives us a really dramatic comparison. You can pick everything from fine art paper to photo pearl to even another display, which is right down here. And you can emulate any output device that you want as long as you have a profile for it. In fact, if you work with a lab, you can ask them for a profile of the machine that they're using, install that on your computer, and they should be able to give you directions on how to do that. And it's also available through the Photoshop help or Lightroom help. You can install that and then use that to preview your edits before you send them off to the lab. So very powerful tool, readily accessible. It's a must do for photographers who are serious about the quality of their work. Here's a couple of screen grabs, A and B, and you can see there's a dramatic difference between the two of them. B is that plain paper profile that I selected in the earlier slide. And you can see that there's a loss of contrast, the colors aren't very saturated, etc., etc. Not very satisfying. And A is a profile for a luster style paper, very saturated, nice contrast, good detail, and you can really see the difference between what's going to happen at the end of the road. Now, I chose these two because they're about as far apart as two papers could possibly get. You've got a matte finish paper that doesn't take ink very well to begin with, and you have a high-end professional level specialty paper that's absolutely designed for this kind of image. So what you can see is, first of all, the difference in the outcome depending on your paper choice, but also as you start to edit, you're going to see differences become magnified between B and A as you go along. Let's talk about another tool that can help you manage the quality of your images in your final print. It's called Gamut Warning. And Gamut Warning is right here underneath your Proof Setup and Proof Colors menu choices, View to Gamut Warning. And when you turn that on, in particular with the plain paper selection, you can see all these areas that turn magenta, and that indicates areas which will not print well with that printer paper ink combination. Now you could choose another one. You could choose a different paper, you could choose a different printer, etc., etc. But in this particular case, this combination is not going to work well for you unless you make some adjustments. And so Gamut Warning is telling you that the printer and the ink and the paper that you're using aren't capable of delivering the kind of quality that you're going to want to have. So what do you do about that? So there's a number of ways that you can deal with editing an image when you see this kind of gamut warning. I'm just going to give you one example. There's probably a half dozen options that you have. One way to deal with this is, since we know that we're in the orange and reds territory when we're dealing with a lot of those magenta warning signals in the previous slide, is to go to a hue saturation adjustment layer, pick the reds, and bring the saturation down in a step at a time until most of the gamut warning goes away. Now, in this case, you can see that in the areas that were previously covered by the magenta tone, you can see the poppies again, but the color is significantly affected. It's really, I would say, hammering the image. And so clearly plain paper is not the choice that we want for this image. We would probably want to switch to something that can carry ink better and give us a better rendering with better quality. Let's talk briefly about some of the changes that have been made in Photoshop CS6. It's been simplified and I think improved in a number of ways. First of all, we've gone from 3 columns to 2, so it's been consolidated. It makes it more compact and gives you a larger preview area for your print. Some of the tools that were in this before include match print colors, gamut warning, and show paper white. Match print colors is a soft proof just like it appears on your main screen in Photoshop. Very useful last look at your image before you go to print. It does depend, however, on you enabling Photoshop manages colors and the printer profile, which I'll discuss in a little bit more detail in a minute. The gamut warning is available, although it's shown in gray rather than the magenta that I selected as a custom feature, and so it's a little harder to see. In the past, show paper white was provided in the Photoshop printing preview, but it isn't really that useful a tool in previous versions of Photoshop, CS4, CS5. The paper white that it showed us tended to be too dark and too yellow. It's been improved significantly. I think that some people will find it useful, particularly if they're using fine art paper. But I think that your mileage will vary, and based on your personal preferences and your color perception, that you may or may not want to use it. Also take note, this red arrow is pointing to an area that has hash marks on it. Photoshop is now providing information about which part of the paper is printable and which is not. The hash marks show us what's not printable, and the white area shows you the part of the paper that can be printed to effectively. So if your image overlaps into the hash marks, you have to resize it down a little bit. Now on the right here, top to bottom, printer setup, you're going to select your printer. And of course you have your normal print settings dialog in which you would choose the kind of paper that you were going to use and some other color management settings. Here under color handling, you have two choices, by the way. You can say printer managed color or Photoshop managed color. And almost without exception, I would recommend Photoshop manages colors, and then pick the paper profile for the printer paper ink combination that you're going to be using. You really don't get much benefit out of printer managed color. The processing power in the printer is limited. You're much better off using the processor and the sophisticated software on your desktop or laptop. You're going to pick normal printing, and rendering intent can be either perceptual or saturation depending on your preferences. In many cases people recommend saturation rendering intent. I guarantee the picture police will not come to your house if you experiment with this and make 2 prints instead of 1 and see which one works best for you. Past versions of Lightroom did not provide soft proofing, and so in my view that left it as sort of the red-headed stepchild of the Adobe offering. It was not the greatest thing to be editing what I would call blind. You really couldn't see where you were going. It simply showed you a preview based on a color space called ProPhoto RGB. And now things are different. Now they actually have honest-to-God soft proofing. In fact, in CS6 and in Lightroom, I believe that the same software engine is driving the soft proofing in both applications. And that makes Lightroom much more attractive to me as a primary editor. The library module now stores all the previews in Adobe 98 RGB, and the develop module does the same. So we're in a position now where Lightroom fits in with a lot of the new displays that are coming out, which run in Adobe 98 or close to it. A lot of printers are moving closer to Adobe 98. So everything is starting to fit together much more effectively, and it's also giving us that all-important preview of what's going to happen when we go to our output device. This is a detailed view what you get when you click on the drop-down next to the profile label in the dialog box. You'll see a list of all the profiles that are available on your machine. If you click on the checkbox and then click OK, which is cropped off screen right here, they'll appear subsequently in this list. In this slide I've moved forward, and follow the cursor. I've changed the profile that we're using to Fuji Glossy, and this is a profile that was provided to me by one of the labs. This is very nice lambda style print made on a glossy substrate, and you can see that gamut warning has been enabled. That's toggled on and off by this little icon in the upper right hand corner of the histogram in the soft proofing dialog. And gamut warning's been enabled, and it's obvious that a lot of these yellow areas in the aspens are not going to print well. They're going to be blocked up. There's going to be loss of detail in here and in this area. So we have to do something about that. We either have to pick a different printing substrate, in other words, different output choice, or we have to make an adjustment to the image. So we've moved on to the develop module in Lightroom 4, and take note that I've made a red rectangle in the upper right. I want to show you that right next to the soft proofing label, there's an icon that you can toggle on and off for gamut warning. So not only do we have an accurate soft proof, but we also are able to see gamut warning just like in Photoshop. And this is obviously toggled on, and so these yellow aspens show orange in a lot of areas that we'd really like to see a lot of detail. And what's going to happen if we make this print as is we're going to see a lot of muddy, blended together leaves. They're not really going to look as good as they could. So we have to do one of two things. We either have to change the print substrate that we're going to use, the printer paper in the machine, or we have to make adjustments to the image. So just for the sake of demonstration, I switched to a very large color space. It's called ProPhoto RGB. You can see I'm pointing to it with the cursor. It's inside that red rectangle. And all of the areas that showed gamut warning before have gone away. The ProPhoto RGB is a much broader color space, includes a lot more colors, and is capable of handling a lot more, if you will, saturation. That's one way to put it, than the Fuji glossy paper did. So let's try a more practical solution. Let's make a selective reduction in saturation. And so first thing I have to do, of course, is switch back to the Fuji glossy paper so we get a reasonable comparison. And then I'm going to go to the HSL dialog, and in particular saturation, and bring the orange and yellow saturation down about 15 to 20 points. And in doing so, you can see that the amount of orange gamut warning that you see, follow the cursor, the amount of gamut warning that you see has diminished significantly. And in spite of the fact that in a couple of areas you see little problem areas, there's nothing here that's going to quote ruin a print for you. You're going to see a slight loss of detail in these areas, but really at normal viewing distance it's not going to make a significant difference. So we've got our correction, and we're going to move on to editing the image further. Here's a few tips on printing from Lightroom 4. I would assume that you would go ahead and use application managed color. In other words, you'd be printing with a profile. And down at the bottom of the print module dialog, you'll see the profile notation and the drop-down menu, very similar to what you saw in soft proofing. And the same profiles are available, and you can select your printer, paper, ink combination just like you did before, and of course your rendering intent. And I strongly encourage you to use application managed color, but there is one caveat here, and that is that if you're using certain kinds of printers, you're going to have to turn off color management manually. And let's go to the next slide. You can see here that if you were using an HP DesignJet, it's going to turn off or disable printer color management features. Now, what's the reason for that? If you specify a profile in the application and you leave printer color management turned on, you're going to get a double profile, and it's an infallible sign that if you get a print that looks like nothing you've ever seen or expected, with all kinds of bad transitions and pixelization and mismatched colors, 99 times out of 100 you've double applied your color management. Now, some of the Epson printers require that you turn off color management, and there is a module in the drop down here that allows you to do that. You need to check the instructions for each printer as you go back and forward in time. Each printer is a little bit different, and so is the dialog. I can't possibly cover them all. But the point is simply make sure that either the printer turns off the color management automatically when you specify a profile, or that you do it manually, and you'll be all set to make a great print. Now, getting close to wrapping up, here's a slide with an image that shows you a not so great working environment. It's a good illustration of using a desktop viewing station which has color corrected lights, a dimmer and such, and so you can use that to compare print to screen very nicely. There are some issues in this illustration with the ambient lighting. I think it's way too bright. I think it's probably overpowering anything that can be done with display or viewing station. And the display doesn't look quite right to me. It's very, very blue in this photograph as compared to the print, so I'm a little bit suspicious of the color management. But at the end of the day, if you can get your screen calibrated the right way, use the Spyder 4, get it calibrated to the specs that we talked about before, use soft proofing on screen, and use application managed color to make your prints, I think you'll find that you get very, very nice results very consistently. You'll get away from the print, tweak the color, print, tweak the color to edit your image and get good prints or good output on the first pass. So thanks for your time and attention. I appreciate it. I also want to thank Datacolor as the sponsor for this webinar. It's www.datacolor.com, and of course my colleague David Tobie, and there's the specs for his WordPress blog and his website. And of course you can reach me at davidsaffir.com. And one thing I do for my students, if you want to ask a question, please do send me an email at dsaffir@mac.com, and I'll do my best to get you an answer in a timely fashion.